And I think this is our first event of the year, and I think not too late to wish everyone a happy new year, and I believe everyone stay safe in this pandemic era. And let me just take a couple of slides to introduce who we are. I think for those of you who are not SCS members, and then I would encourage for you all to join us, as well as those who have already SCS members also join our chapters, right? Because we are the one that we believe very dynamic, because we architecture are playing a critical role in the today transformation. So we enable and make a transformation a success. Yeah, so I think for those of you who have participated and attended our last year webinar, and despite a pandemic, I think we have run about more than 10 webinar last year. So we are going to continue this year. Pandemic cannot stop us in the sharing and also doing the work, and of course the passion that we have. And you can see here on the screen that all our committee. So our committee are varied and diverse in terms of their background and the environment. Yeah, I think you can see there from the healthcare, from the banking, from the academic, from the hospitality, from the investment, from aviation, from the transportation, from consulting, as well as from the ministry and agency. So these are our committee. So for those of you who are keen to be part of us, please do contact us. And this is actually the chapter's objective. We are very simple. Our objective is we want to accelerate the EA adoption, because what happened is that I think transformation has been taken place, but success only a few. And of course, EA is one of the way to make transformation, digital transformation successful. And of course, we also want to equip and educate and create a session like this, like today, in terms of the practical EA knowledge, skill set, and best practices, so that we can learn from each other. Basically, those, especially those who have failed or success, so that we don't repeat the failure and we can so-called follow the success. And of course, not to forget the alignment with the government. We want to increase local EA talents. I think I don't know how many of you have tried to search architecture job requirement. Let me tell you, in Singapore alone, I did a check last week. I think still got around few thousands. I think at least 3,000 to 5,000. Not really looking for the architecture role, but the job that require architecture knowledge and expertise. So it is very, very critical. And of course, if we don't build the local talent, then we will get all the import talents. I think it's very, very important that now, especially during this pandemic, it's not easily to import talent from abroad. So we need to have the talent locally developed. Yeah, so that's why SCS also we do have architecture offering in terms of the training and certification. So do look up into our mailing list and also our website. And this is something that is going to launch. So you all are the first to hear in Singapore. So we are going to launch the Enterprise Architecture Award this year. So I think the objective is that we want to recognize those organizations, those architects who have successfully adopting enterprise architecture in driving transformation in the local context. So basically applicable, we are going to open the registration next month. So we open up to all the local company, government, agency, public sector, ministry to participate, and we want to recognize them. So the objectives, of course, just now I mentioned about recognition to drive a digital innovation. And of course, we want to showcase the story of ES strategic leadership. And of course, we want to showcase also the business impact, because many people think architecture is technical, but actually we are measuring from the business outcome. That's very, very important. And of course, we also want to make Singapore as one of the global epicentric of EI excellence. I think a little bit background, if you're following the Enterprise Architecture Award in the world, I think there are two prominent ones. One is by the Open Group that has been running for a couple of years. So they got the EA Award for Asia Pacific, Europe, and US, as well as by Forrester. So I think this is something that are motivating us, that we need to have to cultivate the Singapore as the center of the activity for EA excellence. So we are launching these EA awards this year, and hopefully we can sustain and continue for many years to come. So in terms of the award, there will be so-called a few categories, yeah, as you can see here, and also a few in terms of the level. Yeah, there will be Hall of Fame, All-Star, Outstanding, Significant, and we do a 3 level of a so-called assessment. First is by our EA ESCO team. So, and also after that will be verified by the industry expert, Dr. Kwong and Witek. Then after that, we will get the second opinion from ISA Global in terms of a quality of our nomination before the council agree and approve the winning. Okay, so we are targeting the winning announcement sometimes in October or November this year. So this is an upcoming event, and I think today, 21st of January, is our first event. So next month we are going to award opening the registration for year award announcement. Then we are running also a couple of the general meeting or the workshop that is upcoming towards 18 November, which is our annual event, and also year award ceremony that is targeting somewhere in the 18 November. So let me just give you the context about what Jamie is going to share. I think Jamie, you can see him going to introduce his slide. So he's one of the experts that I think well known in our today local community, because he has been involved a lot in the teaching and also as a consultant in terms of the ITIL project management, agile, DevOps, and also governance. Yeah, so you can hear directly from him later about his insightful knowledge and experience that we can all learn together. So just give you the context because enterprise architecture and IT services or ITIL, where are the relationship? Okay, so I think this is what happened that in many organizations we have PMO, Program Management Office, and we execute multiple projects. Once we have completed the project, we are going to hand over our baby or our system to the IT services team, because IT services team is where the team managing the SLA and all the services that need to be taken care to ensure the system are sustained. Right. So this is where I think the last part is where the Jamie is going to share more on the IT services about digital service operation. That's very, very key. But however, in many organizations is that if you have only these two systems, you will still face many, many challenges. Who is doing the architecture? Can you just pass it to the IT services team to manage the architecture? Well, yes and no, but it's not their job. It's not their primary focus, although they can do it. Or you let the program management office to do the architecture. Again, if you do that, then how about delivering a project? You need to deliver the project on time, and yet you need to manage the architecture. So what happened is that today in many organizations, they do 2-in-1 or 3-in-1. In the project management, they're bundling the system, design, architecture, and etc. Well, we have been survived in this manner for 20, 30 years. But in the long run, this is not sustainable. So what should we do? So what we need to do actually is that we need to establish enterprise architecture office, whereby the enterprise architecture office is the so-called the team that are working very closely with the key stakeholders, managing the expectation, validating the strategy, developing the capability, drive the innovation. So whatever gap that need to be done, we pass it to the project management team, the PMO, to run. Then after that, it will have a smooth transition to the service operation. And of course, this one need to be supported by single source of truth. So this is also something that I come across in many organizations today. Most of you don't have the bottom part, right? So basically, the transition from the architecture office to the project office or program office is by passing the documentation or Excel. Well, nothing wrong, but in today's era, we cannot live with a static diagram or static documentation or static artifacts. We need to have a digital artifacts, so that we can trace, we can inquiry, and we can do the analysis and understand the impact and dependency. And the top is where you need to get, we need to have a unity between the architecture office, program office, and service delivery office. Yeah, so this is something important. And of course, you might ask, what are so-called the core support or a component or building block in each of the block? EA, development, realization, and the operation. So this is some of the sample, right? So I think you can learn all this from the provider. The prominent provider is ISA and the Open Group. So they got TOGAF is architecture, they have Archimate, they got the Certified Architecture Foundation, Associate, Business Technology Strategy. So all these are so-called the knowledge source for us to be competent or equipped with the necessary skill set and competency to execute transformation with enterprise architecture. And I think the middle one is a very, very prominent. So I think the PM project management, like Prince2 or PMP, and it's been around for the last 20, 25 years, right? No issue. Many of us, I think, in this seminar also have carried that title. But it's still facing a lot of challenges in our IT project because we don't have the left-hand side. The left-hand side need to be so-called separated, need to be decoupled from the execution of the project management. Because today in many organizations is that they put architecture inside the project. So meaning it's like while you are driving, you also repair the car. It's very, very challenging. And of course, we want to have a smooth transition, smooth delivery in terms of the support and services and the management. That's why we need the IT like DevOps on the right hand side. This is also the expertise that I think Jamie will be touching a lot on this upcoming presentation after my next slide. And the bottom part is where we need to have strong governance, right? We need to have the platform or the tool. So these are some of the tools that are proven in the industry. So I think I will not be talking too much because this is more on the vendor side. But yeah, if you have any inquiry, you can contact us. And this is my final slide before we hand over to Jamie that you will learn more. So you might ask, where is the bridge between the enterprise architecture like Toga framework with the ITIL? Okay, so now it's ITIL4. So it's been improved. So you can see here, if you can see from, let me see whether I can turn on the laser pointer. So like this one got preliminary. Here also got the preliminary. This one's mapped with the IT service like service strategy, right? I think later Jamie will brief you, highlight what are those strategy, service strategy. Then after architecture vision, here architecture vision map directly to service strategy and service design. Yeah, so that's why it's more on the service strategy than service design. That's why the color is more green and orange here. Then business architecture, the blue one is there, not really covered, but it's important because business architecture will drive the information system and technology architecture, which is, and also the requirement management, which is also part of the service design. It's very, very important. And of course, the purple one, the opportunity and solution migration, infrastructure migration, this is where you execute the project. This is where the service transition map with the IT services. And the green one, of course, by mineral efficient also map back to service operation. And the last one in the change management, because we do receive change request or update. This is where we need a continuous service improvement in the ITIL. Right. So with that, I think I don't want to steal too much of the limelight from Jamie. We'll hand over to Jamie, and after that, I think we can continue with the Q&A at the end. Right, Jamie, hand over to you.
So ITIL4. The latest iteration of ITIL, previously was 3, and ITIL4 coming out in 2019, so fairly recent. I guess one of the big changes for those that may have done ITIL3 in the past, ITIL3 was since 2007, all the way through to 2019. So if you had studied IT service management in those 12 years, you would have done version 3. And we're going to look at in this section how version 4 is quite different in the way it looks at architecting our services. So about myself, if you haven't done any ITIL, DevOps, Business Agility, or COBIT, Prince2, or other courses before, you might not have seen me, but my name is Jamie Donahue. If you look at my surname and you ignore the G, then it's a bit easier to say, Donahue. And I'm a British-born Kiwi, so I have dual citizenship for the UK and New Zealand, but I've been in Singapore now since 2008. So this is year 13. And I deliver consulting and training in conjunction with our partners. So I have the University of Singapore and also ATD as well in Singapore. For my current focus, so I've taught a lot of different subjects. Some of them, as Aaron mentioned, like project management, we know it, it hasn't really changed much for the last 20, 25 years. So really the newer courses, the hotter courses that I see are more about high velocity IT. And once IT has high velocity or is more agile, then it's logical that the business needs to follow suit, because who does IT hand over to? It's the business. Or who does IT support? It's the business. So if you're going to have high velocity IT, that only makes sense if you're going to have high velocity business. Now I've got 4 topics for today. The first 3 are all related to the multi-speed IT operating model, the topic for today. And section number 4 is just a little overview of if you wish to explore ITIL4 in some more detail. So first, let's talk about why we may want to have a multi-speed model. Now, this quote that's appearing on your screen was written by someone very influential in the world. He's the founder and chairman of the World Economic Forum that's held in Switzerland and hosts a lot of global leaders, a gentleman called Klaus Schwab. Now, you may not have heard of him, but as the founder and chairman of the World Economic Forum, he's obviously someone who's quite well connected in the world affairs. And he made this quote in 2015, so almost 6 years ago now. In the new world, it's not the big fish that eats the small fish, it's the fast fish that eats the slow fish. We really got to think about what is he referring to by new world in reference to what is the old world. So if in the new world, it's all about being faster than your competitor, in the old world, it was about being bigger than your competitor. So if you were in a very large organization, quite often in the past at least, you were in a very dominant position because through your economies of scale and through your massive catalog of service offerings, it was very difficult for new entrants to come into the market and to compete. However, with the rapid evolution of digital technologies, and especially with COVID accelerating this even more, it is very easy for someone to create a business and even a clone of a business that currently exists. So it's no longer about who can grow the biggest. It's about who can deliver value to the customer faster, gets to keep the customer. And if you think about how many times you may have gone to your app store, whether it's on Android or iOS, you've downloaded an application, tried it out, it didn't have value, so you uninstalled it. Now to you, that's not a big deal, but behind that application is a business, is an organization that has invested money to build a digital product, which someone has tried for 5 seconds and said, doesn't add value, I'm going to uninstall. So really being close to the customer or customer-led, as Aaron had in his slide, or sometimes called customer-centric, is really the competitive advantage in the 2020s. A good local example of how this shift in strategy can have a very good effect is for DBS. So this is a quote from 2009 that said, the joke at the time was that DBS stood for damn bloody slow. And that was from the head of strategy of their transformation group. I wasn't aware that DBS stood for damn bloody slow, but then again, I wasn't banking with them in 2009. Apparently in the ratings, the local bank ratings, back in 2009, DBS was the lowest of the 8 or 9 banks in Singapore. And HSBC at the time was the king. Well, what did DBS do? DBS focused on being a fast fish, about getting close to the customer, giving the customer what they want, which was to save the customer time. And through their process re-engineering projects, they were able to save the customer 250 million hours, which is a significant amount. And this article, or this screenshot there that you can see, was from last year, just 2020, where DBS was named not just the best bank of the 8 or 9 banks in Singapore, but best bank globally for 3 consecutive years running. So quite an accolade from shifting their mindset from being a big, stable corporate bank to being a very nimble, what they refer to as a 20-something thousand startup culture. Another bank that started their transformation shortly after DBS, so DBS started in 2009, was a Dutch bank called ING. ING went through a number of high velocity transformations, starting with agile software development in 2010, moving on to DevOps 3 years later in 2013. And then once IT has high velocity in development and operations, IT is no longer the bottleneck, which means that the business needs to keep pace with IT, which is very different in a lot of organizations where IT cannot keep pace with the business. So this is reversing that scenario. The business cannot keep pace with IT. So their final transformation around in 2015 was business agility transformation, which they had called Biz DevOps. So they'd taken the DevOps term and just added biz on the front. So I've called it business agility, but they referred to it there, as you can see in the orange there, as Biz DevOps. Well, what was the positive effect of ING going through that transformation? Now, these lessons learned, this is these screenshots, they're a bit blurry, I know, but they're taken from a case study that you can purchase. So I don't have the full high resolution pictures, but it's taken from a case study that you can purchase from Harvard Business Review. And these lessons learned come from the CEO. And I've highlighted the second item that he pointed out, which is to do with high velocity. So as changing their way they operate, their velocity has increased. They've shortened their time to market, despite reducing their full-time equivalent or their headcount by 30%. Now, how did they reduce their headcount by 30% and have higher performance? A lot of this was through a change of organization design. So rather than having a very tall hierarchy of command and control, going to a much flatter organization with self-managing teams. There is another lessons learned that's in the case study, which I think is very important to highlight. And that's the CEO says that when you change your operating model, it's at the top there actually, when you change your operating model, your productivity, or AKA your efficiency, will drop. So that means your performance, right? Your business performance, what you're able to achieve in terms of output or revenue or whatever, however you measure your productivity, you can expect that to drop when you change the way you operate. It is expected. However, it is short-term pain. Short-term pain is the shock of trying something new. You're never an expert in something new, but if you stick with it, if you focus on the goal, then eventually you will have the long-term success. And in ING's case, they went through that business agility transformation in 2015, and they won Best Bank of the Year the following year in 2016. But they haven't won it since because DBS has taken the crown, and rightly so, maybe. So modern competitive advantage emphasizes the importance of delivering value quickly to our customers, but that doesn't really apply to every single service that we offer. So we're going to explore that in this section, in the second section. So the question at the top there is, how fast do we want to be on a scale between extreme agility on the left-hand side and extreme predictability on the right-hand side? So that extreme predictability may be characterized by a lot of centralization, centralized decision-making, centralized strategies and policies and plans, and centralized frameworks and processes, and centralized performance management systems, very tall hierarchy, segregation of duties, etc., which is very good for being predictable and having a stable organization. However, it does make you slow. So whilst it has plus points, it also has negative points or downsides. On the other extreme, to be a fast fish, we can have decentralized decision-making. We can stop working in heavy documentation and we can start doing things visually on whiteboards using Post-it notes. We could scrap annual budgets and move to rolling budgets. This might be rolling on a week by week or a month by month basis. We change our single best practice frameworks that advocate one way of working to a range of agile techniques that we allow the team to pick and choose the techniques or the tools that are right for the scenario that they're working in. Instead of having functional hierarchies with a finance department, a marketing department, a sales department, a procurement department, and having the handovers between all of those departments, which slows everything down, we can reorganize and have cross-functional teams based around an end-to-end customer journey encapsulated around a product or a service. And instead of having segregation of duties, we can allow the teams to be self-organizing or sometimes even self-managing. But the downside is that we lose the centralized control. We lose the impartiality of segregation of duties. It may be harder to ensure compliance because teams are working in slightly different ways. And so really, we're not looking for, a binary one or the other. We're looking for sometimes somewhere in between. So that's how fast we might want to be. The next question is, how fast do we need to be? Well, if we look at the bottom, we have some industries: telco industry, transportation industry, banking industry. You would find in a traditional setting, maybe 10 plus years ago, that there isn't really much to distinguish these organizations at the bottom. They tend to offer the same things for whatever reason, until the regulator enables a new way of working, in which case, how fast do we need to be becomes, well, how fast do we need to be to stay in business? If you think back to the telco environment many years ago now, and getting 1 gig of data from your carrier of choice at the bottom and thinking that's very stingy, but being told data is expensive, that's all that you get, until Circles.life starts offering 20 gig for $20. And all of a sudden, the telcos at the bottom start to become a bit more flexible. So the competitive nature, especially of this digital world, can definitely influence how fast we need to be, if indeed we want to stay in business. Because once you lose a customer, it's very difficult to get that customer to return. Now let's look at how ITIL defines an operating model. So ITIL is in the space of IT service management. It is end-to-end. It has always been end-to-end. So it doesn't start after a project, despite other frameworks interpreting that ITIL starts after a project. But ITIL was always end-to-end, from a customer asking for something to a customer building a product or a service for a customer, them using it for their usable life, all the way through to decommission or AKA retirement. So service management has always been an end-to-end framework, at least as taught in ITIL. But this diagram that you're seeing is new for ITIL4. And it represents an operating model for a service. So the different layers are, we'll go through each of these one by one, but there's guiding principles. That's a set of rules. We have our governance approach. We have what they call value chain, which is the sequence to how we add value. We have the various practices. So ITIL4 doesn't use the word process. It uses the word practice to imply that there are multiple ways to practice, rather than process, which kind of implies that there is only one way. And finally, an approach to continuous improvement. Now, if you were looking at this diagram from a version 3 context, even if this picture wasn't in the version 3 book, but in a version 3 context, ITIL would be telling you that you are to create one standard operating model for IT. And then you are to force, that operating model, that standard operating model, onto all of the services so that you can have low cost, predictable IT. But having low cost and predictable IT doesn't fit with the previous module, where we were talking about the element of speed as a competitive advantage. So the way ITIL4 is different is it says that, look, this is an operating model for a service. You may have one service value system for service A and another service value system for service B. Now, at the high level, as a concept, they both have the same components. They both have principles, they both have governance, they both have value chain, etc. However, how we govern, how we practice, how often we drive improvement can be very different between service A and service B if one service is optimized for high agility and the other service is optimized for low cost or maybe high predictability. The first section of the operating model is principles. Principles within all British frameworks means the same thing. It means a set of rules. So if you do any British-based course, there will always be a set of principles and it will always be explained as these are a set of rules. Within ITIL4, the rules are universal and so they don't change. Whether you have an agile service or a predictable service, the rules are fixed because the rules define service management. So service management in 2020 is defined, or in the 2020s, is defined as we focus on value. So we understand who is the customer, why do they need us. We always do current state analysis to understand where we are. We take an agile approach to change, which is progressing iteratively with feedback. As much as possible, we try to be data-driven. We think holistically, so we consider what they call the 4 dimensions. We'll see that later on. But if you're familiar with the people, process, technology concept, then this is just an expansion of that concept. We have lean thinking in ITIL4, which is to make sure we always keep things simple and practical, and that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. So if you've ever used an app and it was so intuitive, so easy, then that's indicative of a very advanced team that has refined and refined and refined and refined this product or service to be as simple as it can be. And the final rule is that we should optimize and automate. RPA, robotic process automation, AKA process automation, is a very hot topic. Sometimes people lose sight of the word process and see it simply as a tool like Blue Prism or Kofax or Automation Anywhere or ServiceNow with its orchestration. But really, the fundamental skill set within process automation is process reengineering. So if you're going to practice this principle, this rule, the tool itself, personal preference, but the real skill set in RPA is your process reengineering skill, which cannot be done by a tool at the moment. So the guiding principles are consistent from an operating perspective, whether it's an agile service or a predictable service. So these don't flex, these 7 always apply. But for the remaining sections of the service value system, we can have a different composition. For example, the governance section. Governance within ITIL4 is realized through those activities, evaluate, direct, monitor, which if you have been trained in IT governance, you may identify as, these are the domains within COBIT. And the good thing about TOGAF and ITIL and COBIT and all of the international frameworks is that the owners of these frameworks and these certification schemes do work together to align. So ITIL references COBIT, COBIT references ITIL. So it's never one versus the other, it's one with the other. But COBIT is traditionally quite heavy, advocating segregation of duties, which if we look at an example of a high agility service versus a high predictable service, we may not want segregation of duties. Actually, that should be the other way around. The segregation of duties is yes for high predictability and no for high agility. Now, what would that mean? That would mean that in a high agility context, it would be okay for a developer to test and publish their own code because speed is the name of the game. But in a highly predictable scenario, especially where we have regulation, core banking systems, etc., it would definitely be a necessity to have segregation of duties. So that yes and no needs to be the other way around. Segregation of duties will always slow things down. However, it does increase the scrutiny, the checks and the balances, which makes your predictability increase. For an appropriate framework for change, under agility, they may use agile frameworks. For predictability, you may use project frameworks, perhaps. For a release cycle, if it's a highly agile service, they might release every 2 weeks, which would be 24 releases a year, versus a predictable, highly predictable service, which may only have 4 releases, once per quarter. We may have a different amount of governance artifacts or templates that we require. No standard processes in the high agility scenario. We allow the team to create whatever fits their context. But in the highly predictable, especially the shared services part of our internal organization, it is still very common to have those standard processes because we're trying to drive down the cost of those services. And decisions on architecture from a software perspective, just as an example. Yes, microservice architecture is normal within high agility services, but may not be for our predictable, stable services. For example, our ERP systems like SAP and Oracle, etc., may not support that microservice architecture, but don't need to because maybe they're not changing every single day or every 2 weeks. So that's an example of how the operating model can be contextualized from a governance perspective. The center part of the service value system is called the service value chain. And this is a bit different to ITIL version 3. ITIL version 3 was quite linear in its flow: strategy, design, transition, ops, strategy, design, transition, ops. Whereas in version 4, they say, context is key. It doesn't always go strategy, design, transition, ops, strategy, design, transition, ops. So they identified 6 basic activities, which are engage, plan, design, transition, obtain, build, deliver support, and improve. And they say that these activities are stitched together. These value chain activities are stitched together, and they can be used once, more than once, or not at all. So you think of them as pieces of Lego that you can put together. And maybe I use this piece, maybe I don't, maybe I use 2 of this, maybe I use 3 of this. But I put them together in a sequence that makes sense for me. Now, one example of that is a value stream for a change. So demand comes in from the customer side. We engage with the customer to understand what they need. We go and initiate the planning activity where we look at the value. We think, maybe it does have value. So we initiate some design. If the design is approved, then we obtain or build. Once it has been obtained or built, we go back to design to validate against the design. If it matches the design, then we transition into the live environment. Now, you would expect that value streams are quite generic because they're very high level. And it would be the same generic kind of flow at the very, very high level, whether it's a high agility or high predictability service. So then where does the contextualization come in if it's not at this high level? It would come in the way that value stream is practiced, because the value chain activities are just very high level activities. They're not called phases or stages anymore. They call them activities, but they're very, very high level. And how we engage would be using a number of practices. For example, we may engage using the business relationship management. They just call it relationship management now. That relationship management practice for a highly predictable service, maybe through some formal account manager and go through a committee, and if it's approved, then it moves on to the next step. Whereas relationship management for an agile service may be much lighter. We may rely upon a product owner just to have a conversation on user story level requirements. And if the product owner and the customer agree, then we move on to the next step without all of the complexity of having to go through committees. Now let's look at an example of how we can practice slightly differently for a very common practice that we would know, which is change control. Now, change control is the rebranded change management. ITIL has rebranded change management because of the growth of another practice, which is organizational change management, which is very important if you're doing transformative work. Organizational change management looks at the people aspects of change. So change control has been, or IT change management has been renamed to change control, just to distinguish it from that other practice. So if we look at the change control practice in a high agility scenario, our SLA on how quickly we deal with certain changes could be very different to our SLA for how we deal with highly predictable services. For a high agility situation, it may be measured in hours, days, maybe up to a week or two, versus the highly predictable service, which might typically be measured in months, especially if they have to queue for various architecture committees and change advisory boards and security councils. And, I guess a lot of us can understand the complexity that exists when we want to be highly predictable. The final section of the service value system, aka the operating model, is continuous improvement. And if you had been trained in version 3, you would maybe be familiar with a variation of this diagram, which is a transformative process. And it's very similar, in fact, to the transformative process within COVID. It's also very similar to the transformative process within TOGAF. So it starts with what is the vision. Vision may be called target, may be called goal, may be called objective. Then we do a current state assessment. Once we've done a current state assessment, we look for the gaps, which is number 3. Where do we want to be in 6 months' time, in 1 year's time, in 18 months' time? Then we plan the gaps, which is step number 4. Then we execute the plans. Then we say, did we get there? And if we did, then how do we keep momentum? What else can we transform, or what else can we improve? As an example, let's say we're using this in a service desk setting for a service desk service. We have set, or the service desk manager has set a target, CSAT, which stands for customer satisfaction, of at least 8 out of 10. So that's the goal. The service desk manager sends out questionnaires. It comes back with 5 out of 10. Okay, so there's a gap. We analyze the gap. We come up with some milestones. Milestone number 1, we would like in 6 months' time to hit 6 out of 10, and within 1 year, we would like to hit 8 out of 10. So then we come up with our plans to hit milestone 1. we need to train our staff. We need to simplify the processes used at level 1 to hit milestone number 2. We have a plan for implementing a chatbot, a basic chatbot, which is basically just sitting on top of an FAQ. So then we execute the first plan for milestone number 1. We hit the target. We execute the plan for milestone number 2. We hit the target. Did we get there? Yes, we did. Or maybe we got close and we're still happy either way. Then the final question is, how do we keep momentum? And, you know, this is where the service desk manager, in partnership with the customer, would look for another target that they feel is important. And here's an example of reducing turnover for the service desk. So the continual improvement cycle is very, generic. It's very common across different frameworks. As I said, it's very similar to COBIT. It's very similar to TOGAF. One of the questions comes down to how often should we do this? And, it's the same in TOGAF as well. You have to really think about your scope, because you can create, a 5-year transformation plan. But if you think about what's happened in the world today with COVID and Washington, DC, and all the craziness of the world, does it still make sense to try and plan 5 years into the future? So ITIL, gives this guidance too and says you need to think about it. So one of the ways to think about it is, when it comes to driving improvement, let's say we've got 2 companies, company A, company B. At the end of the year, both companies have released 12 features with their product. So A and B, from January to December, by the time they get to December, both have 12 new features. However, their cycle was very different. Company A did 3 features per quarter. Company B did 1 feature every month, but at the end of the day, it's still 12. My question is, maybe you can post this in the chat, is which company do you think has the competitive advantage? Okay, so I see 1 for B. Anyone else? Company B as well? Okay, B. Okay, so there's a trend. Okay, I've got 1A from Bruno. Now, Bruno, if we were in a classroom, I would ask you to share why. But really, to me, the company that would have the competitive advantage would be company B. Now, the reason is, each time you release to a customer, you have a customer interaction. And you learn what they like and what they don't like. And that can drive what you work on for the next month. So company B has had 12 customer interactions and potentially has learned 12 times what the customer likes or doesn't like, whereas company A has only learned 4 times, presuming as well that they were able to hit their quarterly release, which they may not have done. Maybe they only got through 3 releases because of usual project delays. So if in year 1, company A has learned 4 times and company B has learned 12 times, there's quite a difference between how much learning company B has over company A. Now we extend this to year 2. Now company B has learned 24 times. Company A is 8, right? And so on and so on. So it's quite a snowballing effect that the company that is releasing more frequently reduces their costs and reduces their risks because they only have to focus on 1 feature. In addition, they are learning faster than their competitor, and they're meeting the objective from the very first module, which was being a fast fish, right? Delivering value faster than your competition. So the fast fish eats the slow fish. So I would presume, Bruno may be correct, you never know, but I would presume that company B has the advantage in this scenario. And there's no one size fits all. As I mentioned, you have a whole spectrum from extreme agility to extreme predictability. And it's not a binary decision. It's not about being 1 or 0. It was mentioned, I think one of the consulting firms may have mentioned 10 years ago about type 1 companies or type 2 companies, something very simplified, but a hybrid approach somewhere on this scale is more likely to reflect your reality. So here's an example, just purely illustrative, of an organization that has 5 different services, and the goal of each service is slightly different. Some, yes, must focus on extreme predictability, some must focus on extreme agility, and some are somewhere in the middle. So different goals leads to a slight variation in the operating model. That slight variation is your multi-speed IT, or your multi-speed operating model. Now, how do we implement? Very simple series of very simple steps, but can be very complex to do in real life. The first is you have to establish a desire or a need for high velocity. That may be because you're just losing customers and you're going out of business. It may be because you're getting a lot of customer feedback and it's not good. People are not walking out, but they're pretty close. But whatever the reason, you need to light a fire under people, or as sometimes described as creating a sense of urgency. Without a sense of urgency, you can expect complacency. And that's what would have, been the downfall really of the companies in the top left, that the sense of urgency wasn't felt throughout the company. And therefore they were too slow to respond. And by the time they realized, too late. So step number 1 is make sure that we're clear on the need to change from a standardized operating model to a model that has variations, which includes the need for high velocity. The second step would be to identify the services that need high velocity. A service, if you're doing architecture, hopefully you have service models. You can say these are our services and these are our service assets, hopefully. If not, the basic ITIL guidance is that a service is made up of 4, what they call 4 dimensions now. In version 2, ITIL version 2, it was people, process, technology. In ITIL version 3, they called it the 4 Ps, people, process, product, partner. And in ITIL4, they've rearranged the words again, and now they call it the 4 dimensions, which is people, value stream / process, which is number 4. So we've got people, process, information and technology, which is number 2. So we've still got people, process, technology. And then number 3 is our partners and suppliers. So it's still people, process, technology, or it's still the 4 Ps. They've just rearranged it for the new version, but the logic is the same. Hopefully, you don't need to do that because you already have beautiful architecture, and you already have defined your services within your service catalog and those assets, etc. And so it'd be a bit easier to say, okay, here are the services that are contenders for high agility. Then you need to think about the goal for the service. A generic goal is delivering value quickly, right, which is the fast fish, consistently, which is all about the service level or the quality, and sustainably, which is to make sure that we don't go out of business. And there's some examples, of speed and consistency and sustainability that you can refer to in your own time. So having the goal really defines what the operating model is going to look like. So that's why it's very important to establish this very early on. Then you look at your service value system. You can use the ITIL guidance. Remember, the principles are universal, so they won't change. But our approach to governance, our service value streams, the way that those streams are practiced, and our approach to continuous improvement is contextual and will depend on the goal, how that is configured for service A or service B or service C, etc. There are some organizations that have changed the organization model so that everyone who is part of product A sits together. They have done that to reduce dependencies. Not that you have to do that. You don't have to productize your organization model. If you do, there are benefits. There's also downsides. But the idea of productizing your organization model is to resolve the dependency issue, because if you have multiple teams and each team, hands over to the next, hands over to the next, hands over to the next, and so on, you're only ever going to be as fast as your slowest or your lowest performing team. So in the example there, if 4 indicated the throughput, team A can do 4 tasks a week, team B can do 4 tasks a week, team C can do 4 tasks a week. It doesn't really matter because their speed is being regulated by team D, who can only do 2 tasks a week. It doesn't matter how fast everyone else is. They're going to be limited to output as a service 2 tasks per week. So we have to be mindful of dependencies if we are not going to productize or base our organization model around products or services. For models, now if you have many services, let's say you look in your service catalog and you go, oh my gosh, we've got 50 services in our service catalog. Does that mean I have to create 50 service value systems? I wouldn't think so, right? I wouldn't think you need 50. It would be a real architecture headache. What we would usually recommend is that if you have lots of services, you group them in some way. You could group them and say, these are our low-cost services, these are our highly regulated services, these are our high-velocity services, etc. So we can categorize the services and we can put the 50 into maybe one of 3 or one of 4 buckets or categories, and then each category has an operating model. So that would simplify the number of service value systems that you need to architect, implement, manage, and improve. So in summary for this section, organizations that have adopted high velocity operating models, whether it's within IT, within the business, or both, are able to outmaneuver their competitors, and in the case of DBS and ING, sometimes win some very fancy global awards. Whatever operating model you use, whether it's the ITIL operating model or you have an architecture which is a slightly different variation of the operating model, it doesn't matter. Every operating model must be based around a specific goal. How quick do we need to be? What does consistency mean within our context? Is it sustainable? How do we measure sustainability? Is it all about cost? Do we have to think about continuity? Do we have to think about environmental impact? But whatever targets we establish for our goal will define how that service operates. The good thing about ITIL4 with its service value system, because it's an international framework, is that this guidance is being implemented around the world. And so for MNCs particularly, you can have people trained ITIL in Singapore and ITIL in Malaysia and ITIL in UK, and you'll have a consistent language. But even if you're only based in Singapore, the fact that it is an international framework that's used around the world gives you a bit of confidence that you are not trying something which hasn't been proven in practice. And the final item is that there's no one size fits all. So a multi-speed model is normal within the 2020s. categorizing your services can help if you have a very extensive service catalog. And then you can come up with, 3 categories of service or 4 categories of service and architect an operating model for that category. And then you just simply drop the services into the category and you know which model, which operating model you need to apply. Now I'll just pause here because that was the very first section. And I'll look at the questions and then I'll move on to one slide, which is the final section number 4, which just talks about the ITIL4 portfolio. So let's have a look. I've got a question here, Julie. How does security controls fit into governance? What's a good balance of such control and agile or predictable governance? It depends on the context. So, when you're looking at a good balance, who gets to decide that the balance is good? If you're asking the customer, they will always want things as quickly as possible, but the ownership of complying with regulation is not on the customer. So it's not something that they are concerned with or that they even think about. So a good balance would be one that strikes a balance between the targets within the goal that you can see there under step number 2, which is how quickly do we need to be? How quickly do we need to resolve incidents? How quickly do we need to satisfy requests? How quickly do we need to process changes, et cetera, et cetera? For consistency, when we look at quality, it can be based on compliance. It could be based on service levels. It could be based on the amount of throughput, that a team, number of tasks that a team is able to complete. For sustainably, there can be targets around cost, around revenue, around continuity, business continuity, and around environmental sustainability. So that balance is really going to be contextual, but the balance would be agreed and defined within the goal for that operating model or that service. And then that will drive everything else within the service value system. Next question, anonymous attendee. How many models have you seen in an organization? 2 or more. Yeah, I guess in Singapore's context, I tend to see 2. In Singapore. Outside of Singapore, maybe more, but inside of Singapore, number 2. At least from the companies that I've been inside, if I've been teaching or consulting. And what they've tended to do is they have kept their shared services division as it always was, right, with the standard processes and the standard controls, etc. And then they've created a new division, which maybe they call the digital service center, or they give it some fancy title which includes the word digital. And within that department, they have a different operating model, which is the more agile operating model. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as in the slide where I talk about dependencies. So as long as that digital services center doesn't have daily dependencies on the shared services, which is still traditionally slow, it's okay. But if that digital service center is always asking shared services to provision hardware, to open ports on the firewall, to buy licenses, and et cetera, it doesn't matter how many Scrum teams you have in your digital division, they're going to be slowed down ultimately when you look at it end to end, because of that lowest performing part of the chain. Another anonymous attendee, what are the downsides of a product-based organization model? So the downsides is that you can swap one silo model for another silo model, which is you go from functional silos, finance, marketing, IT, etc., and you create product teams, and those product teams become silos. And what artifacts, as Aaron had, the key success factor to enterprise architecture and the rest was that we have that repository at the bottom. If we're not sharing, if we're not setting the time to share, product team A may produce something that's brilliant. Product team B has no idea because there's no interaction between the teams because they're self-sustained, end-to-end teams. And so product B then starts reinventing the wheel. So product-based organization is a matrix model. Functional organization is a matrix model. Matrix models have the same issue. They can end up becoming silos if you're not careful. Just to clarify, another anonymous attendee, just to clarify, service value streams equal model. So the model, I know it gets a bit confusing in ITIL. Let me go back here. Is the service value system. So we say service value system, we say service value chain, we say service value stream. So we have three terms that are very, very similar sounding. So I guess the service value streams just means an end-to-end flow from the customer to the customer. You may call them processes, you may call them customer journeys. The ITIL has the term service value stream just simply because ITIL4 is trying to align with lean terminology, and value stream comes from lean. But when we say model, or when I say model, or operating model, I'm talking about the service value system itself, not just a single value stream. Okay, another question there, anonymous question. How does a product-based organization model look like? I mean, it's just simply as it sounds. Whether you say product or service, it doesn't matter. It's kind of a personal preference. But imagine you have a finance service and you are organized by service. Then within the finance service team, you would have financial expertise as well as product ownership, as well as IT capability, and maybe security capability, maybe user interface design or user experience capability. So really a product or service organization is like project teams because they're cross-functional, but they don't end, or rather they only end when the product ends. So there's no handover. The team that built it runs it. And then they change it. And then they run the changes. And they change it again. And they run the changes, and et cetera, et cetera. So they own the product or the service. They evolve it. And they stay with it until it no longer adds value to the customer. And then instead of handing over, there's no handover. It's just simply decommissioned or retired. That team then gets reassigned. So it's kind of similar to a project team, but it doesn't end. And then a question from Tarek. In order to achieve speed, there should be alignment between organization and IT hierarchies. Unfortunately, many see IT as subservient indeed. Some only see it as utility, some still see that way, yeah, even at a startup stage. Is there a pragmatic approach available? What frameworks can be used to achieve that flow? Yeah, it depends, on the history of, your IT department, because IT departments were originally subservient. They were back office functions. They didn't interface with customers directly. They were not seen as core business, and they were seen as necessary evils. And in some cases, even outsourced, because the business really doesn't care about IT. We can just outsource it to whoever, and it doesn't matter. But that changed with the digital revolution. So when the digital revolution happened, it became obvious that there is no separation between IT and the business anymore. IT is the business is IT, they're one in the same. And we're not supporting the business because we're part of the business. And you know, to quote the CIO of DBS, he said that, you know, DBS views itself as a IT company that has a banking license. And there are other organizations as well that have, you know, adopted that same mindset, that we are an IT company with a telecommunication license, you know, for example. But who facilitated that change in mindset? You know, was it because of a framework? No. It's really because of the leadership of those organizations, just being aware of the changing world around them and just viewing the world differently. And in fact, if the senior leaders don't see the world differently, then they don't push hard enough to change the mindset that IT is not a, you know, a subservient support team. We are fundamentally business. We are one and the same. I think if your organization doesn't view IT in that way, it's just going to take a bit more time. You know, some companies move faster than others, but it's inevitable, I would say. You have to be a digital first organization if you want to survive, unless you are manufacturing toilet paper, in which case it doesn't matter. All right, an anonymous question there. In your opinion, should different operating models be under the same leadership? For example, CIO, yeah, why not? Why not? You know, do you have to set up a new entity or a new division just simply because you have a new operating model? Nothing to say that in any of the guidance to say that. What I have seen is the downside of this problem, which was an organization within Singapore who had segmented IT with a wall, no less. So they had said, this is our traditional part of IT, ERP, shared network, et cetera, no investment for you guys. You guys just stay the same, stay cheap. And we're going to build this new part of the office. We're going to partition it with a full wall, security door. And then we're going to pick certain people, and then we're going to hire other people, and we're going to call that our digital service center. And you may not enter because your door pass doesn't let you in. And what was the result? Well, as you expect, you know, if you've got two children and you treat one with a lot of love and attention and the other one you ignore, what's going to be the result? Resentment, of course. And when there's dependencies, everything falls apart anyway. So your wall, your partitions was for nothing. And in that particular organization, it took about 3 years for the leadership to own up. Maybe they didn't own up because you have to save face, of course. But it took a few years for the leadership to acknowledge, if not directly, but indirectly, that this partitioning of IT didn't work. It was detrimental to the performance of IT overall. And then they knocked down the wall, and it's like the Berlin Wall kind of scenario. You know? So I wouldn't say that you have to segment. I wouldn't think that's a good reason. No reason why you can't have them under one CIO, as long as the CIO is able to switch their mindset that some services run this way and some services run that way, and it's okay that they're different. Next question, if a company offers different services, is there an optimized size of operating model? Since one size cannot fit all, how do we know that we have reached our optimum size? Not really, because context is going to be key. So no framework can tell you, that's for sure. ITIL, TOGAF, COBIT, whatever framework can be frustrating sometimes because you're looking for a specific answer and there's no specific answer. It's all like maybe, could be, might be. It's deliberate by the framework owners, because if they are too specific, then their framework will be limited in its how it's applied. So the frameworks themselves are not going to be specific. The only way you're going to know is what has been the positive impact upon your customer relationship. So are you able to achieve your goal of delivering value quickly, consistently, and sustainably? And how has this had a positive impact upon your business performance targets? Whether that's revenue for a profit-making company or some other measurement if you're a government or non-profit. But are you able to achieve your goals through this particular operating model? If you are, then the operating model is correct, it's efficient. Okay, so there's currently no open questions. Are we going to switch over to the final section, which is just one slide I wanted to show you on the overall ITIL4 portfolio. For those that are interested, ITIL is a framework with a number of certifications. The entry level is called Foundation, and it's a 3-day course. That will teach you the basics of what we've covered. So there's a bit more of an explanation of what we've just covered in the last hour or so. If you have the need, just like with solution architecture, if you're going to be architecting cloud solutions, then you go to a cloud architecture course, for example. So within ITIL or IT service management, it's the same thing. There are a series of intermediate courses that specialize in certain areas. For example, if you are architecting solutions for creating, delivering, and supporting services, then you can attend the ITIL Specialist CDS course. If you are architecting solutions for high velocity IT services, then you could attend the high velocity IT course. You pick the courses that way, then they're relevant to what you're trying to achieve and you find them very interesting. The light blue, just near the top, is the replacement to ITIL Expert. So there is no ITIL Expert cert in ITIL4. ITIL Expert has been split into two, ITIL Managing Professional and ITIL Strategic Leader. If you want those designations, ITIL Managing Professional, you need to do 5 courses, which is Foundation plus the 3 intermediates. If you want the designation of ITIL Strategic Leader, then it's 3 courses, Foundation plus the 2 on the right-hand side. And you might notice there that there is a course which is the same on both sides, which is the ITIL Strategist course, Direct Plan and Improve. So if you are ever going for ITIL Managing Professional and you achieved it, then congratulations. You would only be 1 course away from achieving Strategic Leader. So that's something to think about. For ITIL Master, there's maybe 20 in the world. These are the people who are willing to write a master thesis of how they've implemented service management and the good sides and the bad sides and what they learned. And there's only about 20 people that I think have decided that that was valuable for their career. So not many masters in the world. There's a question there from Dinesh. I have more V3 and ITIL Intermediate, total 22 points. Haven't taken MALC. So it doesn't matter, Dinesh. If you have 17 points in V3, 17, if you look at the bottom left, you can still do the bridge. ITIL Managing Professional Transition. You can still do the bridge for people with 17 credits or more in version 3. So MALC, for those that don't know, it's managing across the life cycle. Managing across the life cycle would typically take you from 17 to 22, and then you would be an ITIL expert. But if you have only 17, you're still eligible to do the bridge, Dinesh. You just need to double check how many points you have. Okay, so that's what I had for you. Hopefully that was useful to see how, another framework, complementary to TOGAF, is looking at architecture, and in this context of architecting a multi-speed operating model based on a specific goal. And then that goal will influence whether the service is designed to be highly predictable, or whether it's low cost, or whether it's high agility, or whether it's some hybrid in between. And final anonymous question there: can we enroll for ITIL specialist with V3 foundation? No, we cannot. If you only have V3 foundation, then you need to start again with V4 foundation. It's quite different. V3 foundation and V4 foundation are quite different. So no bridging at the foundation level. Bridging is only for people who have 17 points in ITIL4 or more, 17 or more. Okay, so that's all I had.